What's the best internet rabbit hole you've gone down? Story 1: Icebergs and Lost Media. The rabbit hole that eats every other rabbit hole. Okay, so if you've spent any time at all in internet mystery communities, you already know exactly what this is. But for everyone else, an iceberg is a tier list style chart, usually shaped literally like an iceberg, that organizes a topic from things everyone knows at the visible tip down, through increasingly obscure layers toward things almost nobody has heard of at the submerged bottom. Lost media specifically refers to films, shows, games, music, or other content that's known to have existed at some point, but that no surviving copy can currently be located, sometimes despite extensive searching by dedicated communities over years. What makes this genre so addictive is the structure itself. You start at the top of an iceberg chart recognizing everything, feel a little smug about it, and then watch your confidence collapse layer by layer as the entries get weirder, more obscure, and increasingly undocumented. The found footage subreddit, the Lost Media Wiki, and a sprawling network of Discord servers dedicated to specific lost media cases have turned this into genuinely organized, methodical research rather than passive consumption. People file FOIA requests, track down former employees of defunct studios, and comb through estate sales for forgotten masters. The successes are what keep people hooked. Entire lost episodes of children's shows have been recovered from Vates tapes found in attics. A work print of a notoriously unreleased film surfaced after decades because someone's relative happened to have a labeled reel in a garage. Each recovery becomes its own celebrated event within these communities, complete with detailed write-ups of exactly how the find happened. The genuinely compelling part isn't just nostalgia. It's the detective work, piecing together fragments of production history, distribution records, and secondhand memories into something resembling a complete picture of media that the rest of the world has simply forgotten ever existed. Story 2: Time Cube, the single web page that became a monument to one man's unraveling mind. Time Cube deserves its reputation as one of the internet's most legendary crackpot artifacts. And what makes it genuinely fascinating, rather than just funny, is the sheer commitment behind it. The site, created by a man named Gene Ray, was a single, sprawling web page that he continuously updated for years, presenting a theory that the Earth operates on 4 simultaneous days occurring within a single rotation, alongside a dense, increasingly hostile stream of declarations against what Ray called educated stupid people and academic institutions generally. The page itself is visually exactly what you'd expect from late 90s personal web design pushed to its absolute extreme, clashing colors. Walls of capitalized text, no discernible organizational structure, and an aggressive, escalating tone that made it read less like an argument and more like watching someone's thoughts spiral in real time. Documented and time-stamped across years of edits. Ray reportedly offered a cash reward to anyone who could disprove his theory in formal debate, occasionally engaged academics who took him up on it, and remained completely committed to the framework until his death in 2015, after which the site eventually went offline, though archived mirrors remain easy to find. What elevates TimeCube above generic internet weirdness is the genuine, sustained psychological commitment on display. This wasn't a joke or a bit. Ray believed this deeply and defended it persistently against a world that treated him as a punchline, which gives the whole artifact an uncomfortable, very human dimension underneath the absurdist comedy value that made it go viral in the first place. It's simultaneously one of the funniest things on the early internet and a genuinely unsettling document of isolated obsession. Story 3: From Victorian death hazards to becoming a full deathling thanks to Ask a Mortician. This is one of the more wholesome rabbit hole origin stories you'll find, and it traces a path a lot of people have independently stumbled into, starting with Victorian-era historical curiosities. The genuinely horrifying litany of accidental poisonings, fashion-related deaths, and medical hazards of the 19th century, and ending up as a devoted subscriber to Caitlin Doughty's death-positive media empire. Caitlin Doughty is a licensed mortician who runs the YouTube channel Ask a Mortician, and her work sits at the center of what's become known as the death-positive movement, a cultural push to demystify and openly discuss death, dying, and the funeral industry, rather than treating the entire subject as something to avoid discussing in any detail. Her content ranges from historical deep dives into death practices across cultures and eras, to explainers on how the modern American funeral industry actually works and where it overcharges grieving families, to genuinely useful, practical information about death planning that most people never think about until they're forced to. The deathling identity that springs up around this content isn't morbid in the way people might assume from the outside. It's explicitly the opposite. It's built around the idea that openly engaging with mortality, understanding the actual biological and procedural realities of death, and talking about it without euphemism or fear is healthier than the avoidance most modern cultures default to. Dowdy has written multiple best-selling books on the topic and helped found the Order of the Good Death, an organization explicitly dedicated to this kind of openness. What makes this particular rabbit hole so common as an entry point is that everyone has some pre-existing morbid curiosity about historical death and disaster. It's a low-friction starting point that, for a lot of people, ends up somewhere genuinely meaningful rather than just grim. Story 4, MK Ultra, Disney, World War II, and Aliens, the rabbit hole that connects everything to everything. This is the rabbit hole archetype, where one real, well-documented historical program becomes the connective tissue, linking an ever-expanding web of other topics. Some genuinely related, and some considerably more speculative, until you're several hours deep, wondering how you got from CIA mind control experiments to Disney movies. As trauma-based programming, MKUltra itself is not speculative. It's a documented CIA program that ran from the 1950s through the early 1970s, involving the covert administration of LSD and other substances to unwitting subjects, sensory deprivation, psychological torture, and behavior modification research, confirmed through a 1975 Senate investigation and a set of surviving documents that escaped a 1973 destruction order. Operation Paperclip, the American program that brought German scientists, some with documented Nazi-era research backgrounds, into U.S. government and military research roles after World War II, is similarly real and well documented. And it's the genuine historical link that gets used to connect MKUltra-era research to Cold War-era institutional continuity. Where the rabbit hole goes considerably more speculative is in connecting this documented history to claims about Disney specifically using MKUltra-style trauma-based mind control techniques on child performers, a claim that has no documentary support and is generally traced to specific, since discredited individual conspiracy theorists rather than any leaked or declassified material. The alien thread gets pulled in via the same loose association logic that connects most government conspiracy theories to extraterrestrial material. Once you're already in the government hides things from us territory, UFO disclosure narratives tend to get absorbed into the same framework almost automatically. The genuinely fun part of falling down this specific hole is learning to separate the documented history from the speculative additions layered on top of it, which is its own kind of research skill. Story 5, discovering Ryan George and losing an entire day to pitch meetings. This is one of the more low-stakes, purely delightful entries on this list, and it's worth including specifically because not every rabbit hole needs to be dark or mysterious to be genuinely worth falling into. Ryan George is a Canadian comedian and YouTuber best known for his pitch meeting series, in which he plays both a fictional studio executive and screenwriter in rapid back-and-forth dialogue, comedically explaining the plot logic, or lack thereof, behind major film and TV releases. The format itself is deceptively simple. George, in two different chairs representing the two characters, delivers a single continuous bit where the writer pitches an increasingly absurd plot point, and the executive, despite obvious red flags, approves it anyway, capturing something genuinely sharp about how studio decision-making and franchise plot holes actually seem to happen in practice. The format has been applied to virtually every major blockbuster, superhero franchise entry, and notable TV finale of the past several years. And the writing is consistently sharp enough that even people who haven't seen the film being discussed often find the bits genuinely funny on their own merits. What makes this kind of discovery such a classic rabbit hole experience is the back catalog effect. By the time most people discover the channel, there are already hundreds of videos covering years of film and TV history, which means a single recommended video reliably turns into multiple hours of consecutive watching, because the format is consistent enough that just one more never actually feels like it requires much of a decision. This entry is a good reminder that internet rabbit holes don't require occult symbolism or government conspiracies to be genuinely worth falling into. Sometimes it's just really well executed, accessible comedy with a deep enough archive to disappear into for a day. Story 6, Metal Detecting in Rivers. The surprisingly massive YouTube subculture Nobody Talks About This is a genuinely underrated entry on a list otherwise full of occult mysteries and cult archives, because river and magnet fishing content represents an enormous, dedicated YouTube subculture that operates almost entirely outside mainstream internet culture's awareness. Despite some individual channels in this space having subscriber counts in the millions, the basic premise is exactly what it sounds like. People using metal detectors for shallow water and riverbank searching, or strong magnets attached to ropes for when it's fishing in deeper water, pulling up whatever ferrous metal objects have settled on the riverbed to recover whatever's accumulated in waterways over decades or centuries of human activity nearby. The actual finds range from the mundane, endless bottle caps, fishing tackle, and modern litter, to the genuinely historically significant, including Civil War-era ammunition, colonial period coins, lost wedding rings, which generates an entire emotionally satisfying subgenre of videos where detectorists track down and return rings to their original, often very moved owners, and occasionally items connected to actual crimes, including firearms that have led to real police investigations. The appeal for viewers operates on a few different levels simultaneously. The genuine, unscripted suspense of not knowing what's about to come up, the historical detective work involved in identifying and dating recovered objects, and a surprisingly strong emotional payoff in the ring return videos specifically, which reliably perform extremely well precisely because they combine mystery, skill, and a genuinely heartwarming resolution. This is a useful reminder that some of the internet's most quietly massive content ecosystems are built around activities that sound almost aggressively unglamorous on paper, but turn out, once you actually watch a video or two, to be genuinely compelling in ways that are hard to fully explain until you're 3 hours deep into someone's backlog. Story 7, Finding UV76 by accident on a shortwave radio in the early 90s. This is a genuinely remarkable first-hand account because it predates most people's awareness of UVB76 by years. The station has since become a well-documented internet phenomenon, but stumbling onto it accidentally on a friend's dad's shortwave radio setup in the early 1990s, before any of this was common knowledge, is a different and considerably more eerie experience than discovering it through a Wikipedia article today. UB76, nicknamed The Buzzer, is a shortwave radio station believed to originate from Russia that has broadcast a short, monotonous buzzing tone repeated at intervals, nearly continuously, for decades. Occasionally, and unpredictably, the buzzing is interrupted by a voice reading a sequence of seemingly random Russian words and numbers in the exact format associated with numbers stations. Shortwave broadcasts believed to be used by intelligence agencies to transmit coded messages to field agents using one-time pad encryption, a method that's genuinely unbreakable without the corresponding physical key, even with modern computing power. UV76 specifically is widely believed by radio enthusiasts and some intelligence researchers to be a Russian military or intelligence communication channel, though its exact purpose has never been officially confirmed. What makes this particular account additionally interesting is the proximity detail. Being relatively close to a major Air Force base and several corporate or organizational headquarters while picking up unnamed, non-famous numbers stations suggests a radio environment genuinely saturated with this kind of traffic in a way most casual shortwave listeners never personally encounter. Numbers stations as a broader phenomenon are real, documented, and several have been definitively traced to specific intelligence agencies after the Cold War ended and some archives became accessible, confirming that at least some of what casual shortwave listeners picked up over the decades really was exactly what it sounded like. Coded espionage traffic, broadcast in the clear, audible to anyone with the right equipment and the patience to find it. Story 8: Psychedelics and Religion. The rabbit hole where mysticism and neuroscience actually meet this entry covers genuinely rich, legitimately academically serious territory, spanning anthropology, comparative religion, and increasingly mainstream neuroscience research, which makes it one of the more intellectually substantial rabbit holes on this entire list, rather than purely internet ephemera. The core thread connecting psychedelics and religious or spiritual experience runs deep historically. The Eleusinian Mysteries, an ancient Greek religious ritual practiced for nearly 2,000 years and considered one of the most significant spiritual institutions of the classical world, are theorized by some researchers, notably in the controversial but seriously argued book The Road to Eleusis, to have involved a psychoactive substance derived from ergot fungus, similar in chemical lineage to LSD, administered as part of the ritual's climactic religious experience. Soma, mentioned extensively in ancient Vedic texts as a ritually significant substance producing visionary states, has been the subject of extensive scholarly speculation about its possible psychoactive botanical identity for over a century, without firm consensus. The use of psilocybin mushrooms, peyote, and ayahuasca in various indigenous Mesoamerican and Amazonian religious and shamanic traditions is extensively documented and continues into the present day, with ayahuasca specifically forming the sacramental center of the Brazilian syncretic religion of Santo Daime. Modern neuroscience has entered this conversation directly through research on the entheogen experience, substances used specifically to produce spiritually meaningful states, with studies at Johns Hopkins and elsewhere finding that a substantial proportion of psilocybin trial participants rate their experience among the most personally and spiritually significant of their entire lives, comparable in self-reported impact to the birth of a child, with measurable, lasting positive effects on well-being and outlook. The genuinely fascinating rabbit hole here is the overlap between mystical traditions across cultures with no contact with each other, independently converging on remarkably similar descriptions of ego dissolution, unity experience, and ineffability, exactly the same descriptive vocabulary that modern psychedelic researchers now use clinically. Story 9-973, 8 Nama 905. The digital labyrinth that reads like one mind's obsession made permanent reverse the title, and you get 905 the human 379. A small, deliberate puzzle baked into the name itself, which is exactly the kind of detail that signals you're dealing with a site built with genuine sustained intent rather than random internet noise. This is a sprawling website filled with dense occult symbolism, repeating geometric grid patterns, and what amounts to an endless, labyrinthine structure of interlinked numerical and textual content, apparently maintained and updated by a single creator over an extended period. Sites like this occupy a specific, recognizable niche within internet mystery culture. They're sometimes referred to informally as outsider art websites, digital cousins to the more famous physical outsider art structures built by isolated individuals pursuing intensely personal visions over decades, like the Watts Towers or the Coral Castle. The internet equivalent doesn't require physical construction materials or zoning permits, which means a sufficiently dedicated individual can produce something of genuinely staggering scale and internal complexity using nothing but a web hosting account and an enormous amount of time. What makes these sites compelling to outside visitors, beyond the genuine visual and structural strangeness, is the same quality that makes Time Cube fascinating. The unmistakable sense that you're looking at the externalist architecture of someone's private internal logic, built without any apparent concern for whether outside visitors can follow it, understand its symbolism, or even find it useful in any conventional sense. There's no commercial purpose, no clear audience being courted, just sustained, continuous output organized according to a system whose internal rules are knowable only to the person who built it. The fact that it's still active and updating, years after its initial construction, adds a genuinely eerie dimension. This isn't an abandoned artifact you're exploring. It's a living, ongoing project, and the person maintaining it is still out there, still adding to it, for reasons nobody outside their own head fully understands. Story 10, The Dionea House. The alternate reality game that was quietly ahead of its time, The Dionea House, deserves genuine recognition as one of the earliest and most carefully constructed examples of horror fiction told through the alternate reality game format, predating the explosion of creepypasta and web-native horror storytelling that would follow it by years, and doing so with a level of structural sophistication that holds up remarkably well even now. Created in 2004 by Eric Heiserer, who would go on to write the screenplay for the film Arrival, among other major studio work, The Dionea House was told not as a single linear story, but across a network of interconnected blogs, written from the perspectives of multiple different characters whose lives intersect around a single, deeply unsettling premise. A house that, in some manner never fully or literally explained, consumes the people who enter it, with survivors and witnesses piecing together fragments of what's actually happening through their own separate blog narratives. What made this format genuinely innovative for its time was the way it exploited the still novel structure of blogs themselves as a storytelling medium. Readers had to actively navigate between different blogs, track posting dates, and piece together a timeline and narrative that wasn't presented to them in any single authoritative location, mimicking the experience of actually discovering a real, unfolding mystery online, rather than simply reading a story that happened to be hosted on the internet. This is the exact structural innovation that later, more famous ARGs and web fiction projects would build on extensively. But the Dionea House got there first, with a level of craft and sustained tonal control that many less carefully constructed successors never quite matched. For anyone interested in the history of internet-native horror specifically, as a genre distinct from horror that simply happens to be posted online, this is close to a foundational text, and revisiting it now offers a genuinely interesting glimpse of web storytelling experimenting with its own medium before most people had a name for what that even was. Story 11, The Octosyllabic Poem Channel, a YouTube account that vanished the moment people started looking too closely. This is exactly the kind of internet mystery that thrives specifically because the underlying facts are genuinely sparse, which leaves an enormous amount of room for speculation to fill in the gaps. A now deleted YouTube channel that, for reasons nobody has ever satisfactorily explained, uploaded thousands of videos consisting entirely of a robotic text-to-speech voice reading poems, with the one consistent, deliberately enforced rule that every single line had to contain exactly 8 syllables. The sheer volume is part of what made this channel notable within the small communities that track unusual or abandoned internet artifacts. Thousands of videos represents an enormous sustained time investment, whether from a single dedicated individual or some kind of automated generation process. And the rigid syllabic constraint suggests either genuine poetic discipline applied at an obsessive scale, or some kind of generative script designed to enforce the constraint automatically across an enormous volume of auto-generated or sourced text. The detail that elevates this from weird obscure channel to genuine internet mystery is the channel's disappearance specifically coinciding with internet sleuths attempting to trace the account's IP address or other identifying information. A pattern that, when it appears in stories like this, almost always invites the most dramatic possible interpretation. The creator was hiding something, was alerted to the tracking attempt, and disappeared deliberately even though equally mundane explanations are entirely plausible too. Accounts get deleted by their owners or by platform moderation for all sorts of unrelated reasons. And the timing coincidence between people started looking and channel vanished could easily be exactly that, a coincidence rather than cause and effect. What keeps stories like this circulating in internet mystery communities isn't usually strong evidence of anything sinister. It's the unresolved nature of the gap itself, which is endlessly more compelling to speculate about than a boring, mundane explanation would be, even when the boring explanation is statistically the more likely one. Story 12 Interface, the surreal web series that built its own disturbing philosophical universe interface, created by the visual artist working under the name occupies a genuinely distinctive niche within independent web animation, an avant-garde, deliberately disorienting animated series centered on a surreal entity named Mischief, exploring themes of memory distortion and what the work itself frames as reality deformation, built with a visual style and narrative logic that owes more to experimental art film and dream logic than to conventional web series storytelling. What makes work like this genuinely difficult to summarize cleanly and genuinely compelling to the specific audience that finds it is its deliberate resistance to straightforward narrative interpretation. Rather than following a conventional plot structure with clear character motivations and resolution, surreal philosophical web animation in this tradition tends to operate more through accumulated atmosphere, recurring visual and thematic motifs, and a kind of dream logic internal consistency that rewards repeated viewing and active interpretation over simple, passive consumption. In the same broader creative tradition as work like David Lynch's more experimental film output, or certain strands of art house animation that prioritize mood and ambiguity over conventional plotting. This kind of independent, deeply personal creative project tends to accumulate small but genuinely devoted audiences within specific corners of the internet. Places like certain animation-focused forums, art criticism Discord servers, and dedicated fan wikis where viewers collaboratively attempt to decode and interpret symbolism and thematic through lines that the creator has deliberately left open-ended rather than explained. For anyone falling down this particular rabbit hole, the genuine reward isn't a tidy explanation of what everything means. It's closer to the experience of engaging seriously with a piece of visual art that's explicitly built to resist easy summary, discovering layers of thematic coherence through your own sustained attention rather than through anything the creator hands you directly. That kind of active, collaborative meaning-making is exactly what tends to produce the most devoted, long-running fan communities around otherwise extremely niche, independent work. Story 13, the 404 Infinite Loop Web. Pages built specifically to trap and confuse search engine bots. This entry describes a genuinely clever and somewhat obscure category of early 2000s web infrastructure, built not for human visitors at all, but specifically as a kind of defensive or adversarial mechanism, aimed at the automated crawlers and scrapers that search engines and other automated systems, used to index and harvest content from across the web. The basic mechanism described here: pages that generate endless, procedurally produced gibberish text, specifically structured to keep automated web crawlers and scraping bots trapped in an unproductive loop, consuming their processing resources and bandwidth without ever reaching genuinely useful content. Represents a real and documented category of technique from the early web, sometimes called spider traps or crawler traps. These were built for various reasons. Some site owners use them to waste the resources of scrapers attempting to steal content without permission. Some were used as a form of protest or obstruction against specific crawlers considered abusive, and some early spam and SEO manipulation schemes used similar infinite generation techniques in an attempt to manipulate search rankings by producing enormous volumes of keyword-stuffed but essentially meaningless content. The orphaned, unindexed framing in this entry is genuinely interesting because it suggests these specific pages have, somewhat ironically, become exactly the kind of forgotten internet artifact that the broader lost media and internet archaeology communities specifically enjoy excavating pages built explicitly to be unindexed and avoided by search engines have, by design, become genuinely difficult for ordinary search-based browsing to locate even today, which paradoxically makes them a small but genuine challenge for internet archaeologists trying to map and document the structure of the early web in its entirety, including its deliberately hidden or obscured corners. There's something genuinely fitting about a category of web content built explicitly to be invisible to search engines, eventually becoming a minor cult curiosity precisely because of that invisibility. The same property that made these pages functionally useless for their original adversarial purpose is exactly what makes them interesting artifacts for people specifically interested in the parts of the internet that conventional search was never meant to surface. Story 14, Laughing Horse Orifice Q. The website, widely debated as either net art genius or total madness, this entry describes exactly the kind of chaotic, maximalist, deliberately overwhelming website that periodically resurfaces in internet culture discussions, specifically because nobody can fully agree on how seriously to take it. A sprawling structure of anti-government, conspiracy content, flashing visual elements, hidden source code messages, and looping audio, built at a scale and with a level of structural complexity that suggests genuine, sustained, obsessive effort rather than a quick joke site. Sites built in this style sit at a genuinely interesting cultural intersection point between sincere outsider conspiracy content and the deliberate aesthetic tradition of net art, an actual recognized art movement from the late 1990s and early 2000s, in which artists specifically used the technical limitations, visual conventions, and chaotic aesthetic possibilities of early web technology as their medium, often deliberately mimicking or parodying exactly the kind of low-budget, maximalist, hyperlink, heavy conspiracy, and personal obsession websites that were genuinely proliferating across the early internet at the same time. This ambiguity is exactly what makes sites in this category so persistently discussed and debated within internet culture archives. Is this a genuine, sincerely held outsider political and conspiratorial worldview, expressed through the chaotic visual and structural language native to the early web? Or is it a deliberate, knowing artistic performance of that same aesthetic, created by someone fully aware of the genre conventions they're working within and exploiting them intentionally for artistic effect? In many of the most famous examples of this genre, the honest answer seems to be that the creators themselves may not have drawn a hard distinction between the two possibilities, blending genuine political conviction with a clearly self-aware, performative relationship to their own chaotic presentation style. Hidden source code messages specifically, content embedded in a page's underlying HTML that's invisible to ordinary visitors but discoverable by anyone who actually inspects the raw code, add a genuinely rewarding layer of discovery for visitors willing to dig past the surface chaos, rewarding exactly the kind of obsessive, patient exploration that these sites seem built to encourage in their most devoted audience. Story 15, Pronunciation Book. How a calm tutorial channel slowly became an apocalyptic ARG. This is one of the most celebrated and well-documented alternate reality games in internet history, precisely because its slow-burn transformation from completely mundane content into something genuinely unsettling happened gradually, in full public view, over an extended period, allowing a real-time audience to actually watch the shift happen rather than discovering the whole thing after the fact. Pronunciation Book began as exactly what its name suggests, a clean, simple YouTube channel uploading short videos of how to correctly pronounce various words and phrases, content with no narrative ambition whatsoever, and a small but genuinely engaged subscriber base who found the videos useful for exactly their stated purpose. Then, gradually, the uploads began to shift in tone, still ostensibly pronunciation videos, but increasingly incorporating cryptic numerical countdowns, unsettling phrasing, and content that felt deliberately off in ways that were initially subtle enough that viewers debated whether they were imagining a pattern or whether something genuine was actually happening. The slow escalation eventually gave way to a full-blown, genuinely sprawling alternate reality game called Bear Stearns Bravo, involving an elaborate science fiction narrative, numerous connected channels and accounts, real-world clue locations, and a dedicated, highly active community of followers attempting to piece together the unfolding story in real time, treating it less like passive entertainment and more like an actual, ongoing collaborative investigation. What makes pronunciation books specifically beloved within ARG history communities is exactly this patient, gradual structure. Rather than announcing itself as a mystery or game from the outset, it weaponized the mundane, trustworthy reputation of its original content specifically to make the eventual unsettling shift land with considerably more impact than a project that had signaled its own genre from the beginning ever could have. The transformation itself became the story, which is a genuinely sophisticated piece of narrative design hiding inside what looked, for years, like the most boring possible YouTube channel. Story 16 Markov Chain Spam Fields. When primitive AI text generators accidentally wrote poetry, this entry describes a genuinely fascinating and somewhat underappreciated category of accidental digital art, emerging from technology that was never intended to produce anything resembling literary or artistic value. Markov chain text generators, a relatively simple statistical method for generating text by analyzing patterns of which words tend to follow which other words in a source text, then using those probability patterns to generate new, statistically plausible, but not actually coherent sentences. These generators were deployed extensively in the early to mid-2000s, primarily for search engine manipulation purposes, producing enormous volumes of text stuffed with relevant keywords, hosted on dead or abandoned blog domains, specifically to game search engine ranking algorithms of the period, which were considerably less sophisticated at detecting nonsensical or machine-generated content than modern search algorithms are. The resulting pages were never meant to be read by actual humans. They existed purely as a numbers game aimed at automated ranking systems. What's genuinely interesting, and what internet archaeology communities specifically enjoy excavating from this particular corner of web history, is that Markov chain generation, despite producing text that's technically nonsensical, at the level of overall meaning and logical coherence, often produces individual sentences and short phrase combinations that land with a strange, accidental, poetic quality, juxtapositions of words and images that no human writer would have deliberately chosen, but that occasionally land with a genuinely evocative, almost surreal resonance, purely through statistical chance. In the same spirit as how cut-up poetry techniques, deliberately rearranging text fragments to produce unexpected combinations, have been used intentionally by actual poets and writers for decades. Finding and curating the most strangely beautiful fragments from these otherwise purely functional, spam generation text fields has become its own small genre of internet curiosity hunting. Proof that even technology built with the most purely mercenary, anti-human intent can occasionally produce something genuinely strange and lovely entirely by accident. Story 17 The Grave Robber Goodwill Album. A single unexplained photo that led nowhere and stayed that way. This is one of the more genuinely unresolved entries on this entire list, and it's worth appreciating specifically for that lack of resolution. Internet mysteries don't always wrap up neatly, and this one is a particularly clean example of a mystery that generated real, if limited, official attention and then simply stopped, without ever producing an answer. The premise is straightforward and unsettling. Someone purchased a blank, otherwise unremarkable photo album at a thrift store. The kind of secondhand object that ends up at Goodwill specifically, because nobody wanted to keep it after a move, an estate sale, or a general decluttering. Tucked inside, separate from the album's intended purpose of holding personal photos, was a single photograph showing two individuals, both blindfolded, sitting together in what appears to be a swamp or wetland environment, with no other context, captions, or identifying information anywhere in the album to explain who they are, when the photo was taken, or what's actually happening in it. The image was shared online specifically because of how genuinely disquieting it is, without any accompanying explanation. Blindfolds suggest either a ritual, a punishment, a game, or something considerably more sinister, and the swamp setting adds a layer of remoteness and discomfort that a more mundane location wouldn't carry. The photo reportedly prompted enough public concern and online attention that local police looked into it briefly, but without any identifying information to work from. No visible faces, no location markers, no metadata. The investigation reportedly went nowhere and was closed without resolution. What makes this kind of artifact endure in internet mystery communities, despite or because of its complete lack of resolution, is precisely the absence of any explanation to fill the gap. There's no satisfying ending here, no eventual identification, just a single disquieting image that exists permanently in an unresolved state, inviting endless, ultimately unanswerable speculation. Story 18, the most mysterious song on the internet. 30+ years and nobody has cracked at this, is one of the genuinely most famous and most extensively, methodically investigated mysteries to come out of internet culture. And what makes it remarkable isn't just the mystery itself, but the sheer scale and persistence of the collaborative effort that's been thrown at solving it without success. The song, commonly just called the most mysterious song on the internet, within the dedicated community that's formed around trying to identify it, is a catchy, clearly professionally produced new wave track that was recorded off a German radio broadcast sometime in the 1980s, with the original recording capturing only the song itself and none of the surrounding broadcast information that would normally allow easy identification, like a DJ announcing the artist and title. The audio quality is good enough that it's clearly a real, polished studio production rather than an amateur recording, which makes its complete absence from any music database, royalty collection society record, or living person's memory genuinely strange. The dedicated investigation community, organized substantially through a specific subreddit and associated forums, has pursued this with a level of rigor that goes well beyond casual internet sleuthing, cross-referencing German radio station archives and playlists from the relevant era, analyzing the song's audio characteristics for clues about recording equipment and studio techniques specific to certain countries or time periods, attempting to identify the language being sung itself a contested question, with theories ranging from German to a Romance language to invented or non-lexical vocals, and repeatedly, systematically combing through obscure regional new wave releases from across Europe that might match the track's specific sound. Despite literally thousands of hours of collective investigation across more than a decade, the song remains completely unidentified. No band, no title, no confirmed country of origin, making it one of the cleanest, most thoroughly tested examples of genuine collective internet research, failing repeatedly against a problem that, on paper, sounds like it should eventually yield. Story 19, The Grifter, the cursed video file legend that predates most modern internet horror. Tropes This entry describes an early image board era legend that predates and partially established the template for an entire subsequent genre of internet horror fiction involving supposedly cursed or psychologically damaging media. The idea of a video, file, or image so disturbing that simply viewing it causes genuine psychological harm to the viewer. A trope that's since become a recurring staple of creepypasta and internet horror fiction generally. The Grifter specifically refers to a legendary, supposedly corrupted video file that circulated as rumor and secondhand account on early 2000s image boards, reportedly causing severe psychological distress in anyone who actually watched it though. And this is the detail that distinguishes genuine internet legends of this type from straightforward hoaxes with an actual payload. No verified, confirmed copy of the actual video file has ever surfaced publicly, despite extensive searching by people specifically motivated by morbid curiosity to track it down. This particular structural feature, a legendarily dangerous piece of media that nobody can actually produce, is extremely common across this entire subgenre of internet horror mythology, and it's worth understanding why that absence is actually structurally important to how these legends function and persist, rather than being a flaw in the story. A confirmed, locatable copy of the supposedly dangerous file could be examined, debunked, or at minimum demystified through direct exposure. The persistent absence of any confirmed copy is precisely what allows the legend to remain maximally frightening indefinitely, since the actual content can never be checked against the escalating secondhand descriptions and rumors that accumulate around it over years of retelling. Stories like The Grifter function less as documented events and more as a kind of collaborative, decentralized horror fiction, built and embellished collectively by a community over time, with each retelling adding detail without anyone ever needing to actually produce the central artifact the entire legend supposedly revolves around. Story 20 Gargoyle Caviar, the encrypted subforum that claimed to trade coordinates to buried time capsules. This is a genuinely obscure and unusual entry, and what makes it distinctive among internet mysteries is the specific combination of elements involved. Not just a hidden or cryptic online community, but one that claimed to be coordinating something with a genuine physical world component. Hidden objects buried at real locations, accessible only to people who successfully navigated the community's elaborate communication and verification system first. The described mechanics, users communicating entirely through heavily encrypted text blocks rather than plain, readable language, suggests a community that valued obscurity and exclusivity as a core organizing principle, deliberately raising the barrier to entry far beyond what a typical hobbyist forum would require, in a way that either reflects genuine security concerns about the physical locations being discussed, if the buried items were genuinely valuable, or otherwise worth protecting from casual treasure hunters, or functions more as a kind of elaborate, self-reinforcing puzzle and status game for the community's own members, where the difficulty of participation became part of the appeal independent of whether the underlying time capsule claims were even literally true. Communities built around supposedly real physical scavenger hunts, hidden caches, or buried treasure with cryptic, deliberately difficult to access coordination methods have a long internet history, with the most famous mainstream example being geocaching, which uses GPS coordinates and a much more open, accessible community structure for broadly similar purposes, finding hidden physical containers placed by other community members. What makes something like Gargoyle Caviar distinctive, assuming the description is accurate, is the much higher barrier to entry and dramatically smaller, more secretive community structure, which raises genuine questions about what exactly justified that level of operational security for what's nominally just a hobby treasure hunting community. Without more documentation surviving from the dead subforum itself, it's genuinely difficult to assess how much of this was real coordinated activity with real physical caches versus an elaborate collaborative fiction the small community built and maintained collectively, which is itself a recurring uncertainty across many of the more obscure entries on this entire list. Story 21 The Blind Maiden Site, a modern urban legend built entirely around a website that may not exist. This entry is a genuinely interesting example of how digital native urban legends have evolved to mimic the structural conventions of older oral folklore. Specifically borrowing the classic ritual conditions must be precisely met structure that's appeared across centuries of folklore. Bloody Mary in the mirror, calling on a specific spirit at a specific hour, and transplanting that exact narrative structure onto a website instead of a physical ritual space. The legend's specific requirements, accessible only at exactly midnight, only on a night with no moon visible, with the claimed consequence being a forced, involuntary live stream view of a stranger walking through the user's own home, follows the precise internal logic of classic ritual horror folklore almost exactly, just relocated to a URL instead of a mirror or a candle-lit room. This structural borrowing isn't coincidental. Digital urban legends in this specific subgenre very deliberately echo older folkloric patterns, because that structure is exactly what makes a legend feel genuinely unsettling and culturally sticky enough to spread and persist, regardless of the specific medium involved. What's notable and genuinely typical of this entire category of internet legend is the complete absence of any verified site matching the description, any screenshot, or any first-hand account from someone claiming to have actually accessed it under the specified conditions and experienced the described effect. This is structurally identical to the grifter's cursed video file discussed elsewhere on this list. The absence of any locatable, examinable artifact is exactly what allows the legend to persist and spread without ever being debunked through direct confrontation with the actual underlying reality. Legends like this spread primarily through forums, social media reposts, and horror content compilation videos, almost always presented secondhand. I heard about this site, that, rather than through any first-person claimed experience, which is itself a structural tell-distinguishing pure internet folklore, built and embellished collectively over time. From genuine documented incidents with actual locatable evidence behind them. Story 22, Substation 33. The shortwave anomaly that sounded like telemetry from somewhere underwater. This entry sits in genuinely interesting territory adjacent to the UVB 76 number station story covered elsewhere on this list, describing a different but thematically related category of unexplained shortwave radio phenomenon, an anomalous signal reportedly overriding established local frequencies in the Pacific Northwest during the 1990s, producing what listeners described as automated telemetry data, seemingly originating from some kind of underwater source. Telemetry, in radio terms, refers to automated data transmission, typically numerical or sensor data being relayed automatically from some kind of monitoring or tracking equipment back to a receiving station, without direct human voice communication involved. Hearing something that sounds like genuine automated telemetry data on an unauthorized, anomalous frequency, particularly one that seems to be interrupting or overriding established local broadcasts rather than simply occupying unused spectrum, would be a genuinely unusual and noteworthy event for shortwave hobbyists actively monitoring that part of the radio spectrum during the relevant period. The unknown underwater source framing specifically connects this kind of anomalous signal report to a long-standing category of speculation within radio enthusiast and conspiracy-adjacent communities about classified naval and oceanographic research and communication infrastructure, submarine communication systems, underwater research equipment, and military oceanographic monitoring networks are all real, documented categories of technology that do use specialized radio frequencies and communication protocols, some of which remain at least partially classified, which gives speculative connections like this a thin but genuine thread of plausibility, even without any specific confirmed source for this particular reported anomaly. Unlike UV76, which has been extensively documented, recorded, and discussed across decades by an enormous global community of shortwave enthusiasts, anomalies described as regionally specific and apparently undocumented outside of secondhand personal accounts are considerably harder to verify or investigate further, which leaves stories like Substation 33 in a permanently uncertain category, plausible enough to take seriously as a genuine personal account of something real and unexplained, but without the kind of sustained, cross-verified documentation that would move it from anecdote into confirmed internet mystery. Story 23, the Slayer S_Boxar Ghost Match, a corrupted StarCraft replay that made the AI play like it was angry. This is a genuinely fun, niche entry specifically because it sits at the intersection of competitive gaming culture and classic internet-haunted file mythology, applied to a context, a StarCraft replay file, that most people outside competitive gaming circles would never think to associate with this genre of mystery. Slayer S_Boxar is a real, legendary figure in competitive StarCraft history, widely considered one of the most influential and skilled professional players in the game's storied competitive history in South Korea, where StarCraft achieved a level of mainstream cultural and competitive significance that's genuinely difficult for non-Korean audiences to fully appreciate, complete with televised matches and celebrity-level player recognition. A replay file specifically attributed to or associated with him circulating through old Korean gaming forums carries inherent cultural weight within that specific community, well beyond what an equivalent file involving a random, unknown player would carry. The specific anomaly described, corruption in the replay data causing the game's built-in AI-controlled players to exhibit aggressive behavior patterns that observers describe as seemingly deliberate or human in character, rather than the more predictable, formulaic aggression patterns typical of standard AI opponents, touches on a genuinely interesting technical question about how game AI decision trees actually function and what happens when the underlying data driving those decisions becomes corrupted or malformed in unexpected ways. Most game AI, including older Warts game AI from this era, operates on relatively rigid decision trees and behavioral scripts. Data corruption producing behavior that pattern matches as more intentional or human-like to observers is a genuinely interesting, if almost certainly coincidental, rather than literally meaningful emergent effect of how corrupted data can interact unpredictably with scripted decision systems. Whether this specific file and story are documented with any surviving evidence or exist now purely as forum legend passed down through Korean and international StarCraft community lore, the appeal is the same one driving most haunted file internet mythology, the unsettling, almost magical thinking idea that broken data might accidentally produce something that looks like intention. Story 24: The Loom Chat Rooms. When people stopped typing and started talking in procedural music instead, this is one of the more genuinely creative and unusual entries on this entire list. Describing hyper-obscure, invite-only ERC channels from the late 1990s where participants reportedly abandoned conventional text communication entirely in favor of custom software that translated their input into abstract, procedurally generated musical tones, communicating through sound patterns rather than written language. ERC, Internet Relay Chat, was one of the dominant real-time text communication protocols of the 1990s internet, and its open, extensible, somewhat technically permissive architecture made it a natural breeding ground for exactly this kind of experimental, custom software-driven community innovation. Since ERC clients and bots were frequently modified or built from scratch by technically capable users experimenting with what the underlying protocol could actually support beyond standard plain text chat. The specific concept described here, abandoning legible written language entirely in favor of procedurally generated musical communication, sits in a genuinely interesting historical lineage alongside other experimental communication systems built by small, dedicated communities throughout history, similar in spirit to invented languages, constructed musical notation systems used as private code, or other deliberately exclusive communication methods designed specifically to create a barrier that only committed insiders could cross, making participation itself a marker of genuine community membership rather than something casually accessible to outsiders. Whether the resulting conversations actually conveyed complex, specific meaning the way written language does, or whether participants developed a shared, intuitive sense of mood, tone, and approximate intent through the musical patterns without literal translatable content, is exactly the kind of question that's genuinely difficult to answer without either surviving recordings or first-hand accounts from actual participants describing their own subjective experience of using the system. Communities this small, this technically specific, and this deliberately obscure from this particular internet era frequently leave almost no durable public trace once the small number of people involved move on, which makes confirmed, well-documented accounts of genuinely unusual communities like this one, if it's accurately described, a genuinely rare find for anyone interested in the stranger. More experimental corners of early internet culture. Story 25: The Utah Monolith Coordinates. Mapping exactly how long that thing had been sitting there, the Utah monolith was one of the cleanest, most genuinely satisfying real-world internet mysteries of recent years. Precisely because it was discovered, investigated, and substantially resolved within an extremely compressed time frame, giving the entire online community a rare experience of watching a mystery actually get solved in close to real time, rather than lingering unresolved for years. The basic story: in November 2020, Utah State wildlife helicopter pilots conducting a routine bighorn sheep population survey in a remote desert canyon spotted a tall, gleaming, perfectly rectangular metal structure planted upright in the ground, in a location with no obvious access road and no record of any authorized installation. The object's clean geometry and reflective metal surface, set against the completely raw, undeveloped desert canyon backdrop, produced an image with an almost deliberately cinematic 2001, a space odyssey quality that made it spread across social media within hours. What made the internet's response genuinely impressive, rather than purely speculative, was the systematic, methodical approach a number of dedicated amateur investigators took almost immediately, combing through historical satellite imagery available through Google Earth's historical timeline feature, attempting to pinpoint exactly when the structure first appeared in the available image record. This process successfully established that the monolith had actually been present at that exact location for a meaningfully longer period than its sudden viral discovery suggested. It had sat there, completely unnoticed by the public, for what satellite records indicated was at least several months, possibly longer, before the helicopter survey crew happened to spot it. The monolith was removed within roughly 2 weeks of its discovery by a group of recreational hikers, and similar structures subsequently appeared in several other locations worldwide, generally accepted as deliberate copycat installations once the original generated such intense and immediate viral attention. This is one of the rare entries on any list like this, with a relatively clean, satisfying, substantially resolved ending. Story 26: The 1996 Usenet Spam Bombs. Millions of identical cryptic messages, and an attacker, who was never caught this, describes a genuinely significant and well-documented historical internet disruption event, occurring during an era, Usenet's mid-1990s peak, when it functioned as one of the primary global text-based discussion infrastructures, predating the social media platforms that would eventually absorb most of its functions, making a successful, sustained attack against it a meaningfully significant disruption to global online discussion infrastructure at the time, in a way that's somewhat difficult to map on to current internet infrastructure, with its considerably more distributed, redundant architecture. A coordinated spam attack of the scale described here, millions of identical, cryptic text strings flooding forums and discussion threads simultaneously, represents a genuinely serious technical and coordination achievement for an attacker operating in 1996, when automated bot networks, scripting tools, and the broader infrastructure that makes modern large-scale spam and bot attacks comparatively trivial to execute were considerably less developed and less accessible than they would become in subsequent decades. Pulling off an attack at the scale being described, with 1996-era tools and infrastructure, required either unusually sophisticated technical capability for the period, or a genuinely large coordinated effort involving multiple participants, rather than the single-person, automated script attacks that became commonplace in later years. The culprit never found element is consistent with the broader pattern of internet history during this specific transitional era: internet infrastructure governance, security investigation capability, and cross-jurisdictional law enforcement cooperation for purely digital offenses were all considerably less developed in the mid-1990s than they would become even a decade later. Which means genuinely disruptive incidents from this specific period frequently went uninvestigated, under-investigated, or simply unresolved compared to how a comparable attack would likely be handled today, with considerably more developed digital forensics and international cooperation frameworks now available. Stories like this are a useful reminder that the early internet was somehow safer or more innocent is largely a myth. Genuinely serious, disruptive, coordinated attacks happened then too. They were simply harder to investigate and document thoroughly given the tools available at the time. Story 27, the Red Room Mythos, the dark web legend that security experts keep calling a scam the Red Room legend, is one of the most persistent and widely circulated pieces of dark web mythology. And it's genuinely worth separating the cultural phenomenon of the legend itself, which is real, well documented, and has been circulating in various forms for well over a decade. From the underlying claimed activity, which security researchers and dark web investigators who have actually studied this space consistently categorize as fraud rather than confirmed genuine criminal activity matching the legend's description. The core claim is that highly exclusive, extremely difficult to access websites exist on the dark web, allowing paying users, typically using cryptocurrency for the anonymity it provides, to view live-streamed footage of violence or torture, and even vote in real time on what happens to the victim next. Essentially monetized interactive violence presented as entertainment for a paying audience. This is unambiguously an extraordinarily disturbing claim, and its persistent circulation across forums, social media, and dark web-focused content for over a decade has cemented it as one of the most well-known pieces of dark web folklore, regardless of its actual underlying truth. Security researchers, dark web investigators, and journalists who have specifically and seriously investigated Red Room claims have consistently found the same pattern. Sites claiming to offer this service are, with remarkable consistency, scams designed to extract cryptocurrency payment from credulous or morbidly curious visitors in exchange for access that, once paid for, either never materializes at all or delivers pre-recorded, non-live, non-interactive footage rather than anything resembling the genuinely live, votable experience being advertised. No confirmed, independently verified case of a genuine, functioning Red Room matching the full legend has ever been substantiated by serious investigation, despite extensive searching by researchers specifically motivated to either confirm or definitively debunk the phenomenon. The legend persists regardless, partly because the dark web's genuine, real association with serious documented criminal activity in other areas lends a thin plausibility to claims like this that a comparable legend about the regular surface web simply wouldn't carry as effectively. Story 28, the Toynbee Tiles. Hundreds of real street plaques about resurrecting the dead on Jupiter the Toynbee Tiles are one of the genuinely best documented and most extensively investigated real-world, rather than purely online mysteries, to become a major subject of internet research and speculation. Precisely because the physical evidence is so extensive, so widely distributed, and so consistently strange that it's attracted serious, sustained attention from documentary filmmakers, journalists, and amateur investigators for decades. The tiles themselves are small, handmade plaques, typically constructed from layered linoleum and asphalt crack filler material, embedded directly into street asphalt at intersections across multiple major American cities, predominantly Philadelphia, but documented in numerous other cities as well, including a confirmed presence stretching as far as parts of South America. The consistent core message across the vast majority of documented tiles is a cryptic statement referencing resurrecting the dead specifically on the planet Jupiter, combined with apparently paranoid, rambling references to a perceived conspiracy involving journalists and the Sri Lankan government specifically. An oddly specific detail that recurs across tiles found in completely different cities and apparently installed at different times over a period spanning decades. The installation method itself, embedding a durable tile permanently into asphalt at a street intersection, requires the creator to work directly in active traffic, typically at night, with enough deliberate technical preparation, hayering, and curing the tile material in advance than installing it quickly, that this clearly represents sustained, deliberate, repeated effort by someone committed to this specific, strange project over a genuinely extended period, rather than a single isolated incident. A 2011 documentary, Resurrect Dead: The Mystery of the Toynbee Tiles, conducted a serious, methodical investigation and developed a credible lead pointing toward a specific individual believed responsible, though the case has never received the kind of definitive, universally accepted confirmation that would fully close the mystery. The tiles remain one of the most genuinely substantial, physically verifiable mysteries on this entire list. You can, even now, go find some of the surviving ones yourself. Story 29, Terminal 00. A web labyrinth you navigate by decoding source code, not clicking links. Terminal 00, created by artist Angus McNeven, represents a genuinely sophisticated and technically demanding example of experimental web art specifically designed to resist the passive, frictionless browsing experience that most modern websites are deliberately engineered to provide, instead requiring active technical engagement, reading and interpreting raw source code, executing pixel-precise clicking sequences just to progress through the work's hidden structure at all. The visual framing, mimicking a broken, post-apocalyptic operating system interface, complete with glitch art aesthetics and a deliberately degraded, malfunctioning visual language, situates the work within a recognizable and well-established tradition of digital art, exploring themes of technological decay, system failure, and the unsettling aesthetic possibilities of corrupted or malfunctioning digital interfaces. A tradition that draws visual and thematic inspiration from glitch art more broadly. A movement that deliberately exploits or simulates digital errors and corruption for aesthetic and conceptual purposes. What distinguishes Terminal 00 specifically from more passively consumed glitch aesthetic web art is the structural requirement for genuinely active technical investigation as the actual navigation mechanism. Visitors aren't simply scrolling through or clicking obvious, clearly marked links. They're required to actually inspect underlying source code for hidden hints, comments, or non-obvious interactive elements, and execute specific, precisely placed clicks that aren't visually signposted as clickable at all, fundamentally raising the technical and investigative barrier to fully experiencing the work compared to virtually any conventional website. This kind of deliberately difficult-to-access structure has been specifically interpreted by some viewers and critics, per the framing of this entry, as expressing a kind of transhumanist digital philosophy, the idea being that the work's own resistant, demanding structure mirrors and comments on humanity's own complex, often opaque, increasingly technologically mediated relationship with digital systems generally. Whether or not every visitor reads that specific philosophical depth into the experience, the sheer technical commitment required to navigate it at all guarantees that anyone who does complete a meaningful portion of Terminal 00 has engaged with it far more actively than the vast majority of web content anyone consumes in a typical day. Story 30, Heaven's Gate's floppy disks. The real rabbit hole isn't the website. It's what's underneath it. The Heaven's Gate cult's official website is already a genuinely well-known internet artifact in its own right, preserved exactly as it was at the time of the group's mass suicide in 1997. Complete with its distinctly dated late 90s design aesthetic, the site has functioned for decades as a kind of unsettling time capsule, maintained continuously online specifically because the surviving members and subsequent caretakers wanted the group's beliefs to remain accessible exactly as originally presented. This entry points towards something considerably less widely known and considerably more genuinely obscure: the existence of dedicated data archiving communities who have spent years tracking down, recovering, and carefully cataloging raw data recovered from the actual physical floppy disks the cult members used internally prior to the 1997 deaths. For their own internal digital design and communication work, the technical infrastructure underneath the famous public-facing website rather than the website itself. Recovering usable data from floppy disks that are now several decades old presents genuine technical challenges independent of the disturbing subject matter involved. Magnetic storage media degrades over time, and the physical drive hardware required to even read older floppy disk formats has become increasingly rare and specialized, meaning this kind of recovery work requires genuine technical expertise and dedicated equipment, undertaken specifically by communities with a serious interest in digital archaeology and historical preservation rather than casual internet curiosity alone. What makes the recovered material specifically described here genuinely interesting, beyond morbid curiosity about a notorious cult, is the mundane technical specificity of what survives: raw vector graphics files, internal code repositories, and text logs documenting the actual day-to-day technical workflow the group used to build and maintain their digital presence. There's a genuinely strange, haunting quality to seeing the ordinary, technical, almost bureaucratic project management residue of a group remembered almost entirely for its catastrophic ending. A reminder that even history's most infamous tragedies were, in the months and years leading up to them, full of completely mundane administrative and technical work, indistinguishable on the file level from any other small organization's digital housekeeping.